Hello, everybody. We are recording. This is Vash, Roz, and Jeff Garis, who is our special guest. He is a man who wears many hats. He is the director of the engagement director for the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, the outreach and engagement director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. He also is with We the People PA, which deals specifically with state issues, and the 99% Pennsylvania, which deals with federal issues. So Jeff, say hi, Jeff.
Hello, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Jeff is, if you want to know what's going down in Pennsylvania, Jeff is the man to talk to. So we are extremely honored and delighted to have Jeff here on Zoom to tell us a little bit about what is going on in Pennsylvania right now with dealing with COVID-19 and also things that predated COVID-19 and the problems that will continue to plague us and solutions that we can have through and after COVID-19 in Pennsylvania. So I'm just going to pass this along to Jeff. We started out saying you wear many hats, and can you just tell us a little bit about what you're doing, your work, your goals, issues, initiatives, anything that you would like to tell us about? Please feel free.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here. It's always great to spend time with folks with Tuesdays with Toomey. Appreciate your diligence in keeping one of our U.S. senators on his toes, the one that actually has to be kept on his toes in many cases. So yeah, we're obviously facing a really difficult situation here in Pennsylvania and obviously across the whole country and around the globe. This is a pandemic that's worldwide. U.S. is being hit particularly hard right now. And I think that, we have to really look at this as almost sort of a twofold crisis. One is obviously the immediate health crisis. That's why, efforts and measures have been put into place to try to slow the spread of the disease, bending the curve, as they talk about. And it looks like that has been working fairly well so far in Pennsylvania, in comparison to some other places. There were folks who were not happy when the governor put into place measures that effectively had people staying at home, closed down a lot of non-essential businesses. But, I think that at least some of the most recent numbers I've heard suggest that while we're still seeing a huge number of cases and more people who are dying from the disease and our hospitals being stretched, beyond their capacities, we're probably in a better shape than if nothing had been done and folks had just been walking around. This is highly contagious. Folks are often without symptoms, but are spreading it to other people. The idea that some folks had early on trying to make comparisons to the flu, just not accurate based on how contagious it is and how lethal it is. So that's one side of the crisis. The other side of the crisis is one that probably has its roots a lot earlier than the coronavirus outbreak, and one that will probably last a lot longer. That's obviously the economic crisis and the implications of COVID-19. And I say, it has its roots much earlier than coronavirus. This is something that has been really building for decades in this country. We had, coming out of the Great Depression in the 20th century, policies that were put into place as part of the New Deal that effectively not just brought the United States out of the Great Depression, but really created the middle class in this country, and that dealt with issues of trying to minimize economic and wealth inequality in the country. And that's when a lot of folks look back at times and they say, well, we had households where you could run the entire household on one income, and folks didn't even necessarily need a college degree because there were jobs that paid people a living wage that they could support a family. But what we've seen now for 4 decades has been a systematic dismantling of those programs, and more of an everyone for themselves, except not really. Policies that have been put into place have made it possible for those who are already extremely wealthy to become even wealthier and to amass more and more of a share of wealth and the share of income. And so we've seen more and more folks as time has gone by over these 4 decades, who are just barely making ends meet. 2-income households, sometimes folks who are working 2, 3 jobs, folks who are doing things like, driving Uber on the side or Lyft to try to make some additional money. And that has been something that's been building for a long time, is that, folks have not really had the ability to plan for long-term unemployment, to even plan for, retirement. People have been working just essentially hand to mouth to get by, and with a lot of economic stress and a lot of worry about that. And now that we've had this huge crisis strike, now we're finding out how very, very quickly folks are becoming very desperate, because they really were struggling to make ends meet to begin with. Right now in Pennsylvania, it looks like we have about 1.25 million people who have applied for unemployment benefits since the pandemic started. And that's just folks who qualified under the old rules for collecting unemployment benefits and receiving unemployment benefits. Part of what came out of the most recent bill coming out of Congress that Trump signed was this CARES Act from a few weeks ago. That, in part because a lot of Democrats in the House held their ground and insisted on it, puts in an additional $600 a week for unemployment, and also expands unemployment benefits to the many people who are independent contractors, people who are consultants, people who are self-employed, people who are gig workers, people who are doing jobs like driving for Grubhub or Uber, things like that. And in fact, folks, and I know somebody who was just contacting me a couple days ago, someone who's an independent business person in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, who is self-employed and knows that with the legislation that's been passed, she will be able to apply for and receive unemployment benefits. However, how that works has not yet been fully worked out yet. State of Pennsylvania is still trying to get some clarity from the federal government about how to do that. And essentially they have to set up an entirely new program. I think there's even going to be a new website for that. That is still a week or two off. So there are a lot of folks who are independent contractors, self-employed, gig workers, who have been unemployed now for weeks, who we don't even know how many of them there are, because there's been no way for them to formally apply. And that still may be another week off or so. So, this, of course, has ripple effects all throughout the economy. It involves things like people trying to repay their student loans, people making rent payments, mortgage payments, other kinds of payments, car payments, things like that, aside from just simply, putting food on the table for their families. And that's going to have long-term implications. I think, unfortunately, we know that there are probably some businesses that, sorry, I've got people here in my house.
It's okay, I have cats.
Yeah. But things are they're not just going to flip a switch and open the country back up for business and everything moves forward like it was a month ago. There are folks whose jobs are not going to be coming back. And I think that, there are going to be some things that we're going to see, the implications of what this has been like psychologically for people, a lot more businesses shifting more and more to doing a lot more online than they did before. So I'll pause there and say, those are the two sides of the crisis that I see, the healthcare crisis and then the long-term economic one that is really, in many ways, manifesting, bad public policy priorities of the last few decades.
Right. Yeah. So Toomey actually, because we are trying to address how Toomey is or is not helping or with this crisis. Toomey in a response letter dated on April 6th, basically says he's been laser focused on expanding our capacity to test on a large scale. And he also says that he has been working and he basically came in full support of the Senate bills, but the Senate bills that didn't necessarily address the the issues and failings in these bills that you spoke about. Can you tell us a little bit? Do you have any thoughts on what Senator Toomey is doing well and can do better in regards to in regards to his response to this crisis?
I'll start off by saying that both parties in both the Senate and the House of Representatives actually, came together and worked on some packages for relief. There have been 3 major packages so far. The most recent one was this one, the CARES Act, that really was, genuinely a negotiated agreement. It had support, in both chambers and both parties. That's certainly good. There are a lot of things that have been left undone, though. There are some implementation issues related to the CARES Act. And then there are some things that really need to be addressed as it's become clear that this is going to be a long-term economic crisis, that, it's not just going to end by snapping your fingers and saying, we want these churches packed on Easter Sunday, or by saying we're opening the country back up for business. You open it back up for business, a lot of folks are not going to be ready to run right out and sit in restaurants.
No, I certainly won't be.
Yeah. So, there's a need. The CARES Act was a good first step, and particularly in addressing some of the immediate needs. But there are needs that are now going to be popping up for long-term efforts, for long-term programs. One of the big issues, there's the whole funding of this, stimulus checks, giving money, putting money into the hands of people, everyone in the country, with some exceptions. One, this has not been made accessible to folks who are immigrants to this country, who are working and have been paying taxes as well. That's a major deficit in that. One of the other problems too is that folks who have filed income taxes online and who have had their refund checks directly deposited into their bank accounts, those are the folks who are going to get this stimulus money first. But some of the poorest people in this country, people who have had essentially zero income and therefore have not needed to file income taxes, in some cases for years, or have not filed electronically, those folks are going to have to wait a lot longer. Some people are saying it could really even be months before those folks get a paper check sent to them in the mail. So, we think that there's a need to address that. There's a need to make sure that stimulus money gets into the hands, not just of, those of us who have been fortunate enough to be able to get by fairly well, those of us who are still able to work by working, remotely and working online. But some of the folks who are already the poorest people in this country are the ones who we really need to put this money into their hands. So that's an implementation issue that needs to be addressed. And then there are some other long-term factors that need to be addressed. So, what's been done so far has been good. There have been some things missing from that, and there's really a need for Senator Toomey and the rest of Pennsylvania's congressional delegation to step up and address the implementation issues and start to deal with some of the long-term consequences.
I know one thing we are always encouraging people to do is to initiate voting by mail, but it seems as though the post office is in quite a bit of trouble, which is our call to action for today, is to ensure that people call their member of Congress to continue to fund the post office. Has that been something that has been, can you tell us a little bit, because I know you're really plugged into Pennsylvania, of how you think an interruption or, heaven forbid, a collapse of our postal system will affect people throughout Pennsylvania?
Well, it's going to have devastating consequences. First off, there are many, many people who work and support families because they work for the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service, I think, in a lot of ways also serves as a check on other for-profit delivery companies. As long as there is this public option where for, less than $1, you can put something in an envelope, drop it in the mail, and send it anywhere across the country, even, to some of the U.S. territories that are not part of the continental United States. You know, that's never going to be a profitable business. But, you know, it's something that is a vital service that we all need. And I think one of the most dangerous things of, you know, losing the postal service is that, you know, what happens then when for-profit delivery companies, FedEx, UPS, no longer have to compete with a taxpayer-funded, you know, public service like the Postal Service.
Yes.
So I think that's a serious question and a serious concern. And obviously now, you know, Pennsylvania made some really important upgrades to voting just recently, putting into place the no excuse absentee ballot, or you could call it, you know, vote by mail. Vote by mail is only going to work
if there's mail,
as long as there's mail, and as long as it's being delivered relatively frequently and relatively on time. And I think that we're going to see coming up in the primary, which has been postponed here for Pennsylvania, and I think we're going to potentially see it again in the fall when there's likely to be a second wave of COVID-19 that a lot of folks are going to want to, and in fact, most of us may end up needing to vote by mail. Yes. And we need to have the U.S. Postal Service there to deliver those ballots.
I agree. And then, so going forward, what do you see some key issues for Pennsylvania?
Certainly addressing the impact on small businesses. You know, there needs to be additional relief, longer term relief for small businesses. There also needs to be, you know, relief going directly into the hands of people. You know, you can give money to small businesses to help keep them afloat, but if it's the kind of business where they're not bringing their workers back, that's not helping the people who've been laid off, people who've lost their jobs. And it's not going to mean that, you know, companies are not necessarily going to be ready to hire, you know, wait staff for their restaurants if nobody's going to restaurants. And so, you know, in addition to aiding small businesses, there needs to be direct aid to individual working people who are no longer working, people who have provided a service, who have been paying their taxes for their entire working career, who now find themselves, you know, through no fault of their own, unemployed. And it's one of the quickest ways to stimulate the economy is when you put money into the hands of people.
Yes, if people have money, they spend it on things.
Right, they're not taking it and putting it in a Swiss bank account or moving it into some offshore Cayman's Island investment. You know, they're going to be spending it locally in their local grocery stores and places like that. Grocery stores in particular also are going to need a lot of support. The SNAP program needs to be expanded. The SNAP benefit needs to be increased. You know, even if someone didn't care about, you know, low-income people not being able to put food on the table for their families, grocery stores, and particularly, you know, in communities like Philadelphia, are not going to be able to stay in business if people are not able to access and utilize SNAP benefits and to be able to purchase what they need. So there's that impact as well. There's also a real serious need for the federal government to provide aid to the state governments as well as local governments. And this is one of the big areas where we're really concerned. For instance, there's, you know, the FMAP program. That is the Federal Medical Assistance Percentages. That is where the federal government provides funding to administer programs in conjunction with state governments. State governments put in their share, federal government puts in theirs. This funds things like Medicaid. It funds things like the CHIP program, the State Children's Health Insurance Program. It also provides funding for temporary assistance for needy families. That's a small cash payment that goes to the very poorest people, folks who are, you know, not even at the federal poverty level, but are, you know, maybe surviving on 25% of the federal poverty level. All of those programs require state dollars in addition to federal dollars. And there's going to be a need for a significant increase in FMAP funding because, you know, when you have 1.25 million people, and probably more, again, when we count gig workers and independent contractors, we have that large a percentage of the workforce out of work, that is money that the state is not receiving in income tax payments. That is money that folks are not spending on purchases. So there's a drop in sales tax. You know, it hits across the board when you have that many people unemployed. And so the state, you know, could be facing a deficit of, you know, it's hard to tell at this point. I mean, a lot of it is dependent on things, but we could easily be $5 to $10 billion short on our state budget in terms of revenue over the next 12 months. That's a significant loss of revenue. And so the FMAP program really needs to have an increase in that. More funding needs to be going to support states, because states are not going to be able to pitch in the amount of money that they have to fund these programs that serve the most vulnerable, the poorest, the youngest, and the oldest Pennsylvanians. And this, you know, gets into things like, you know, when you're starting to talk about Medicaid funding, that's a significant source of funding that goes into operating our senior citizen communities in Pennsylvania, and our nursing homes comes from Medicaid dollars. Pennsylvania has to put in a share of that money, and that's going to be much harder with fewer and fewer people working and paying taxes.
So if we were to try to focus things to a specific call to action, a specific thing you want us to call Toomey and Senator Toomey, Senator Casey, and our member of Congress, or any, or the governor, or anyone, where would you, who do you think would be the most important person to call, and what do you think would be the most focused call to action? The FMAPs that you mentioned, or?
Yeah, I think it's important. You know, I would say having folks contact the entire congressional delegation, both Senator Casey and Senator Toomey, as well as all of our members of Congress, letting them know that they need to be doing work right now to start to address the long-term consequences of this economic challenge. That would, you know, include increasing FMAP. It would include things like raising the maximum benefit for SNAP recipients. You know, this is tricky because you start to get super wonky on this. I guess the broad call would be that there needs to be additional significant economic relief and recovery funded at the federal level. And it has to be, you know, funding that goes beyond just the immediate health crisis.
Right, more than $1,200.
Right. And in fact, you know, some of the programs, some of the aid that goes to state governments already through the 3 packages that have been passed so far is funding that is set to go for the length of the health crisis. But we really need to see funding to support state governments on the long-term economic crisis that's going to last much, much longer than the health crisis. That's probably the broad call.
Okay.
You know, increasing FMAP, increasing benefits for SNAP recipients, emergency funds for the poorest people, really some serious funding for housing and homeless issues. You know, there's a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, but that doesn't help people pay back the money that they may owe a landlord, or that they may owe their mortgage company after 4, 5, 6 months. You know, they're not being evicted now, but, you know, there's really nothing to help them make up those back payments even after the economy starts to pick up again.
Right, and it's not like the economy is like a computer that you turn on and suddenly it just works the way. It's a slow change, because there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of actual changes, like in behavior and spending will come from a long-term situation that we're suffering through, it seems like.
And, you know, Pennsylvania, you know, our state constitution requires that we have a balanced budget every year. And it's going to be very challenging just wrapping up this fiscal year at the end of June. But, you know, the state budget has to be in place by the start of July. We've postponed the state taxes that were due April 15th. That's now been moved to July. So we're going to end the fiscal year with a lot of the revenue having been postponed and moved into the next year. How does the state begin to fund and figure out how much money it can give to our public schools, which are very dependent on not just local tax dollars, but also on state funding. The state governments are really facing some serious challenges as well. And, the federal government operates a bit differently. You can actually run a deficit. And if there's ever a time for deficit spending, it's right now. This is how you get out of an economic crisis. The federal government can print money. The state of Pennsylvania doesn't print money. So you have to watch out for inflation and things like that. But, the federal government is uniquely poised to provide the kind of relief that everyday Americans and that our state governments need to continue functioning. This is not something that private industry is going to pick up. In fact, private industry is part of, the group that needs additional assistance. So this is a time for the federal government to step up and address the long-term economic consequences of this crisis. And I think it opens a door also to saying, we really need to significantly revamp the way that our economy is structured. We cannot continue to have a smaller and smaller number of people holding more and more of the wealth and the resources while the rest of us, struggle to get by. This crisis is demonstrating that government has a unique role that cannot be filled by any other agency and in any other way, and that we need to address long-term economic problems.
Well, thank you.
So, call your senators, call your members of Congress, tell them, they've done a good start. CARES Act was good, but we really need to see long-term relief. We need to address the economic crisis. It's going to go far beyond just the healthcare crisis. And we need to really begin to address problems that have continued to increase over the last number of decades of economic inequality and people working hard and not being able to make ends meet.
Thank you so much. Roz, is there anything else you wanted to add?
Do you see that as, that particular urgency to change the way that the economy is structured? How likely is that to be a bipartisan concern?
Well,
what do you think are the prospects for for it being understood that really is a vital issue going forward, is making sure that everyone is able to flourish?
Well, the initial package that the Senate, which is obviously controlled by a Republican majority and under the control of Mitch McConnell, the kind of package that they were putting together that became the CARES Act was very different. It was very heavily weighted toward helping large corporations, wasn't really working very much to help state governments or, for that matter, to help individual Americans. It was really only because the U.S. House of Representatives, controlled by Democrats, took a very different approach and had some specific things to build in. This additional $600 per week for unemployment, that's something that the U.S. House required to be put into that. I think that as long as people are reaching out and talking to their members of Congress, letting them know what we need, letting them know what the priorities should be, that's going to be an important part of that. I think unless people raise their voices, we're not going to see a lot of concern for some of these problems that affect individual everyday Americans. People, the line, something that was said by Frederick Douglass, people might not get everything that they work for, everything that they want, but people need to work for everything that they get, because you're only going to get that when you make that kind of demand. And let's not forget, this is a major election year. And, I think folks should let their members of Congress, let our senators know that they're watching very closely. Now, neither of our senators are up for election this year, but, they will be up at some point again in the future. And I think it's important that people make clear what they expect and the kind of relief that we need.
Yes, and Senator Toomey is coming up in 2022. But if whatever we can do to remove as much power from from the current coalition also forces Senator Toomey to have to listen to his constituents, at least more than he is now. Because every step we take is to remove a thread of the current power structure allows us to be heard by Senator Toomey more clearly. Whether or not he chooses to listen is still his decision.
Yep. Like I said, we might not get everything that we need, but we're certainly going to have to push for and fight for and demand.
If you don't fight, you don't win.
Well, thanks for having me here, and thanks to everybody, Tuesdays with Toomey, for continuing to keep this going virtually in the era of social distancing. This is really pretty remarkable. It's very challenging. It's hard to get people's attention sometimes right now, and a lot of folks, are really, kind of depressed and very concerned and scared. And I think it's important that people recognize that this is a way to stay active and a way that ultimately impacts them and their individual families and their lot in life. So thanks for the work you do.
And thank you. So that was Jeff Garis. He is with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. He is the Director of Outreach and Engagement, and we can tell he has reached out and is very engaging. And the 99% Pennsylvania. Go ahead.
We're on Twitter and Facebook, and hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll actually have our website up. But in the meantime, follow us there. We are sharing a lot of information from our national partners, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and others, and sharing action alerts there on our Facebook page and on Twitter. So I would encourage folks to follow us there.
All right, you heard it here first, the 99% Pennsylvania. And thank you all. And this recording is now over.